I'm currently in a complex situation and honestly, I'm unsure how to proceed. I'll outline the events from their starting point. Approximately 6 years prior, my neighbor on the adjacent property, Rob, as we referred to him, informed us of his 15-year-old son's disappearance. He had reported it to the authorities. It was covered extensively in the news and was the subject of widespread attention. My spouse and I felt profound sympathy and consistently offered any assistance within our capacity. As the years passed with no information regarding their son's whereabouts, we presumed they had ultimately come to terms with the likelihood that the worst outcome had occurred. My spouse and I never found the courage to inquire if a recovery of remains had ever taken place. Occasionally, Rob and his spouse, Eleanor, would invite my wife and me over for an outdoor meal during the warmer months. We observed that neither of them seemed quite the same after their son vanished. Eleanor, Rob's wife, was consistently more subdued and introverted, while Rob appeared more uneasy and anxious. Both reactions were, to a degree, understandable. Let's advance a few years forward to just the preceding week. Rob approached me as I was tending to yard work and requested to borrow a spade. Without hesitation, I quickly retrieved my favorite digging tool, not questioning why he needed it. He expressed his thanks and mentioned he merely had some tasks to complete in his rear garden, assuring me he would return it by the following day. He then withdrew into his backyard area. I went inside, and when I was near one of my rear windows upstairs that afforded a clear perspective into Rob's garden, I could discern he was excavating a remarkably large depression in the earth. He seemed to be experiencing some difficulty. He was in his early 60s after all. I considered fetching my spare garden tool and offering my help. As I entered his backyard and called his name, he raised his head from his activity, dropped my spade, and hurried towards me, insisting, No, it's fine. Truly, I've got this. Please just depart." I responded, "What's bothering you? This isn't a significant matter," largely prompted by his peculiar reaction. He stated, "I absolutely forbid you from utilizing that digging tool on my property," and then indicated the gate as if I were an animal. I was so taken aback by his demeanor that I simply left without uttering another word. I returned upstairs to discreetly observe him through the window. He continued working on the excavation for at least another 30 minutes. When it finally seemed he was finished, he began surveying his surroundings, looking upward at nearby structures as if confirming no one was watching. Then, before I could consider concealing myself, he noticed me at my window. All I could do at that juncture was casually move away. He was undoubtedly involved in something clandestine, and I intended to uncover what it was. I periodically checked his backyard, but he was no longer digging. I surmised he knew I was now aware of his activity and would wait until it was dark. My assumption proved entirely accurate. Around 2 in the morning, I detected the sound of a digging tool impacting soil outside. It was now too dark to perceive anything clearly from my window, so I quietly crept outside and peered over the boundary fence into his rear garden. I could distinctly see and hear him digging now. When he entered his residence, I seized that opportunity to cautiously slip into his backyard and examine what lay within the cavity he was creating. The light from the moon alone illuminated a small piece of dark plastic sheeting protruding from the earth at the base of the hole. I glanced towards his back entrance and then back at the hole. I repeated this sequence 3 more times, deliberating whether or not to investigate the contents of the material. Ultimately, I opted to retreat quickly back to my own garden. It was fortunate I did, because he re-emerged outside mere seconds later. However, he was not digging. In fact, he moved towards the opposite side of his house and did not reappear. I re-entered my residence and quietly returned to my bed, striving not to disturb my wife. The following day, my initial action was to look out my window and observe that the excavation in Rob's backyard was completely filled in. I also noted that his sedan was now parked on the driveway instead of in his garage. I have no knowledge of what transpired throughout the remainder of that night, but I am unsettled by the notion that what was at the bottom of that cavity might have been his son's remains. For all I know, he excavated that spot to remove whatever had previously been interred there and transport it elsewhere for disposal. This is all purely speculative. You can label me irrational if you wish. I haven't shared this with anyone, not even my wife, and quite frankly, I am at a loss regarding what action to take. Rob never returned my spade. I have no intention of requesting it back. In fact, he has been actively avoiding me since then, and something disquieting occurred yesterday. By chance, I happened to glance through my window towards Rob's house and observed him standing at one of his windows looking directly into mine. Upon seeing me, he immediately closed his blinds. This transpired in the middle of the afternoon. I have absolutely no idea what step to take next, but I am genuinely apprehensive. I have resided in 3 different homes during my life, 2 with my family and my current dwelling alone. We inhabited the first home for the initial 15 years of my existence and the subsequent home for the following 7 before I relocated to my present residence. This particular encounter took place in my first home when I was 15. Within the final few months, my family occupied that house. I don't recall my family ever cultivating close friendships with the neighbors. In fact, there were 2 adolescent boys living next door with their father whom my brother and I had exchanged words with perhaps only once or twice throughout our entire time living there. As peculiar as that may seem, we did know both of their names, Kevin and Scott. One day, my brother, who is 4 years my junior, and I were outside playing catch on the paved area. It was then that one of the 2 boys from next door, Scott, emerged and approached us, initiating a conversation. I don't recall the precise words exchanged verbatim, but I distinctly remember the first thing he asked was if the rumors of us relocating were accurate. As the older sibling, I conducted most, if not all, of the dialogue. Scott was likely the same age as me. I never actually confirmed it. By the conclusion of the discussion, he extended an invitation for me to accompany him and his brother to discharge pellet guns near the creek bed in the trees down the road the following day. I accepted, as it was the weekend and I had no other commitments. My younger brother spontaneously asked if he could join, not presuming his automatic inclusion. Scott responded affirmatively and then departed. Late the following day, around the late afternoon, Kevin and Scott rang the doorbell. We responded promptly because our parents were unaware of our plan to go shooting pellet guns. Walking along the path with Scott and Kevin, who were outfitted in dark clothing and carrying a carry-all bag containing pellet guns, felt distinctly unusual. The level of seriousness these two clearly exhibited concerning this activity struck my brother and me as quite peculiar, and we repeatedly exchanged glances, occasionally suppressing laughter due to it. We arrived at the wooded area having spoken very little. I could already sense these two were troubled youths. Perhaps the limited interaction explained why we hadn't formally connected with them before. Scott deposited the carry-all onto the ground and unzipped it, while Kevin forcefully detached a rock from the ground and hurled it into the water. My brother and I exchanged another look, this time not finding it particularly amusing. Scott produced a couple of firearms and handed them to my brother and me. It was at that point that Scott delivered the unexpected revelation. He told us they were authentic weapons. Kevin retrieved a loaded firearm from the bag and commenced firing at trees on the opposing bank of the waterway. When I grasped that he was not jesting about the firearms being real, I experienced a mixture of anger and confusion. I took the firearm from my brother's grasp and returned both to the bag. I informed them that we were not comfortable with the situation and needed to depart. Kevin ceased firing, and they both regarded us with expressions that seemed partially resentful. One of the two boys shouted a harsh insult at us as we walked away. I had always harbored a suspicion that these two were problematic youths, but this event confirmed it. I instructed my brother to cease communication with them for the remainder of our stay at that residence. We informed our parents at the dinner table that evening that they were quite peculiar individuals, but we omitted any mention of the firearms. I awoke that night to a rush of cool air against my face. My window was fully open. I felt something firm pressed against the rear of my head as I was gazing out the window, and someone behind me uttered, "Shh." Somehow I managed neither to scream nor jump. I simply remained calm. Surprisingly quickly, I managed to comprehend what was occurring. I heard Scott's voice in a hushed tone behind my head. He conveyed that if I ever disclosed anything to anyone, particularly his father, concerning the firearms or our outing, he would return and eliminate me and my entire family. I responded in a quiet, trembling voice. "Okay." He applied pressure to my head with his firearm before exiting through my window. Every night thereafter for months, I would spot either Scott or Kevin at a specific window in their residence, peering into either my or my brother's sleeping quarters. Their conduct became increasingly bizarre as the date of our relocation drew nearer. Just 1 week before we departed, a small stone was thrown at my window late one evening around midnight. I opened my window and saw Scott aiming a handheld firearm upwards at the window, feeling an overwhelming sense of impending doom. I ducked to the floor only to hear the two boys erupt in laughter. I heard one of them utter a derogatory term aimed at me. There were 2 additional instances that week where the pair would harass either my brother or myself, and ultimately I couldn't envision a more opportune moment for us to move and escape that environment. After all these years, neither my brother nor I ever disclosed anything about the boys or their menaces to anyone. All I know is that those 2 boys were deeply troubled, and it was a blessing we departed when we did. At the time I am composing this account, these events transpired a fortnight ago. I have consistently disliked nearly all of my neighbors. I have recently completed my college education and am residing independently, but this comes at a cost. I am living in a rather unpleasant locality, the only area where I could afford a residence, so I am not likely to encounter exemplary neighbors. The residents on one side perpetually play their music at excessive volume, while the residents on the other side are the most unsettling individuals I have ever encountered. There are two occupants next door, an older woman in her late 50s who is entirely unfriendly and frankly seems somewhat disoriented, and a slightly younger woman who exhibits some form of significant behavioral issues. I have no insight into the nature of their relationship. I would frequently be seated on my front porch when I would glance towards the adjacent property and observe the older woman restraining the younger woman as she experienced some kind of agitated outburst. She would have her arms folded tightly across herself and rapidly sway back and forth while yelling and producing various sounds. Occasionally she would even look over, gesture towards me, and murmur things to the other woman. It is genuinely unsettling. Sometimes I would even retreat inside when I became excessively uncomfortable. Nonetheless, it was an evening like any other. I needed to retire early in anticipation of work the following morning. However, the adjacent neighbors were generating an unusual level of noise. I could clearly hear the disturbed woman screaming and having a fit, while the older woman cried out in distress. This persisted for approximately an hour, and I could tolerate it no longer. I resolutely walked over to the house next door and pounded on the door. The older woman answered, greeting me with a hostile, "What in blazes do you want?" I requested as civilly as possible that they keep the noise levels down. In response, she raised her eyebrows and tilted her head downwards, clearly irritated by my plea. Just then, the younger woman entered the living area, repeatedly yelling, "How dare you!" The older woman prevented her from approaching me and then forcibly shut the door in my face. I had no understanding of what had just transpired, but I felt I had failed to achieve my objective. I returned to my sleeping quarters in defeat. However, I realized they had finally fallen silent next door. I was at last able to obtain some rest. Well, I awoke feeling as though the night had elapsed far too rapidly. I checked my timepiece and observed that it was only 4:00 in the morning. My head fell back onto the cushion in relief, but soon after I thought I detected something originating from the lower level of the house. I rose from my bed and approached my door just to confirm I wasn't imagining sounds. When I heard no further noises, I returned to bed. I awoke once more to a darkened chamber, only about 15 minutes having passed since I had drifted back into sleep. I was unsure what could have roused me, though, and then I heard a distinct scrape. I panicked and attempted to locate my mobile device on my bedside table as a source of illumination. But when I found it, I dared not activate the light. I surveyed the dark room in silence, attempting to discern any shadowy form within the space. I examined every corner of the room, and despite the profound darkness, I could tell there was no one standing there. This time I heard it again, and I knew where it was coming from. I turned towards the side of my bed and perceived a dark, indistinct shape positioned right at the wooden frame of my bed. When the light from my phone illuminated that dark object, it was revealed to be the face of the disturbed woman from next door. She emitted a wild scream like the deranged person she was. She screamed as if exposed to light. I screamed as well. I screamed as I awkwardly sprinted towards the door and stumbled halfway, looking back to see the woman pursuing me. I forcefully closed the bedroom door behind me and raced all the way downstairs, where I locked the door leading to the upper level. I contacted the authorities as the woman pounded on the door, yelling unintelligible things. When the law enforcement officers arrived, I informed them that the woman resided next door and was psychologically unstable. The older woman from next door arrived after hearing all the commotion and conversed with the officers, pleading with them to release her. However, they insisted they had to take her into custody, at least for the night. One of the officers inquired if I wished to file charges, and as he posed this question, the older woman directed the most menacing and hostile glare imaginable at me. I chose not to press charges, but her expression remained unchanged. The officers transported the younger woman away while the older woman continued to stare at me as she walked back towards her residence. 5 minutes later, I observed her entering her vehicle and driving off. Both of these individuals still reside next to me. I am seriously contemplating relocating because the unsettling woman next door makes it clear she harbors contempt for me. And I have concluded that the psychologically troubled woman is not only frightening but also perilous.